Autumn, 1872. Late afternoon shadows stretched long across the dirt main street of Dry Creek, a town so small the prairie winds seemed to whistle louder than the church bell. The sun burned low, painting the cracked boards of the saloon in blood-orange light, and dust swirled like smoke around the boots of men too weary to care. From the far end of the street came the steady gait of a horse, a lone rancher in a weathered coat guiding it through the haze. His face was sharp with hunger and hardship, his hat brim shadowing eyes that had seen too much of the frontier's cruelty. Folks barely looked up until the sound of glass shattering split the silence. The saloon doors crashed open. A drunk stumbled out, whiskey bottle still in hand, his shirt torn, his laughter cruel. He dragged a young woman by the arm, her dress ripped, her face streaked with dirt and fury. She fought him, nails raking at his skin, but he yanked her into the street like she was nothing more than a wager gone wrong. "You see this?" the drunk slurred, waving her before the onlookers. "She's mine, won her fair in cards." A hush fell. The poker players, the shopkeepers, even the preacher's wife standing with her basket of bread, they all froze in the fading light. No one dared move, no one dared speak, except the rancher. He swung down from his saddle, boots hitting the dust with a dull thud. His hand rested on the worn grip of his Colt, the kind of gesture that made the crowd lean back as if the very air had turned electric. The rancher's voice, when it came, was low and cutting. "Let her go." The drunk turned, sneering, bottle raised, revolver hanging loose in his other hand. The last rays of sunlight caught the glass, scattering shards of fire across the street. The woman's eyes darted to the stranger, half with fear, half with desperate hope. The wind howled down Main Street as if the desert itself was holding its breath. But before we continue, make sure to like and subscribe for more untold Wild West stories. The sun had barely dropped below the horizon when the echoes of the standoff still clung to the street of Dry Creek. The drunk had fallen silent, glowering but too tangled in his own stagger to test the steel in the rancher's eyes. The young woman, shaken but unbroken, stood with her wrists red from his grip. Dust and whiskey mingled in the air, the sour stench hanging heavy. The townsfolk, cowards one breath before, found their voices again now that danger had passed. Whispers rippled, sharp as thorns. They weren't whispers of gratitude, they were whispers of scandal. The preacher himself stepped forward, his thin hands raised like a man calming a wild horse. His gaze shifted from the bruised woman to the lone rancher who still stood ready, revolver loose in his hand. "Law of the land is clear," the preacher's voice carried, quivering but stern. "A man who draws for a woman must answer for her. Protection binds the two. A claim defended must be honored before God and community." The rancher's jaw tightened. He had ridden into Dry Creek only for supplies, only to pass the night before riding north again. Now the preacher's words were wrapping him in chains he had never asked for. The drunk, emboldened by the murmur of the crowd, spat blood into the dirt and laughed. "Fine then. You want her? Take her. She's not worth the coin I lost at cards, anyhow." He staggered back toward the saloon, bottle swinging, pride torn but still intact. All eyes turned on the rancher. The woman stood trembling, her chest rising and falling hard, but her chin was high. The silence was a noose. He felt it tighten with every heartbeat. To walk away would brand her as ruined, abandoned. To stay would bind him to her in ways he hadn't chosen. The preacher's wife stepped out, her gray bonnet shadowing her face, voice like cold iron. "There'll be a wedding tonight. God will not let this street become Sodom." By lantern light, the chapel doors creaked open. Inside, wooden pews groaned with the weight of curious bodies. Dust rose with every shuffled step. The rancher stood at the altar, hat in his hands, his coat still smelling of smoke and saddle leather. He had not spoken a word. He had only listened to the creak of the floorboards, the hiss of whispered gossip, and the thud of his own heartbeat. The bride was brought in by two stern-faced matrons, her hair brushed hastily, her dress patched and dirt-streaked. Yet in her defiance there was beauty that no roughness could dim. Her eyes met the rancher's steady, unyielding. She did not thank him. She did not plead. She simply stood beside him, as though daring him to flinch. The preacher raised his Bible, his voice rising above the murmurs, In times of trial, bonds are forged. A man who shields must shelter. A woman defended must stand in covenant. Do you so bind yourselves this day? The rancher swallowed hard. His hands felt heavy as stone. He had buried friends in the dust, driven cattle through storms, stood alone against wolves and men alike, but never had he been pressed so close to a choice he had not made. He spoke at last, his voice low, carrying to every ear. "I'll not see her shamed." The words were enough. The preacher thundered out the vows, his voice rolling like distant thunder across the hollow chapel. The rings were nothing but thin bands, traded hastily from another couple's hands. When it was done, the congregation exhaled as though a storm had broken. Outside, the night was cool, the prairie winds snapping at the eaves. The townsfolk spilled into the street, buzzing with laughter and gossip, children running through dust clouds. The bride and rancher stepped out into the open, their shadows long in the lamplight. She walked beside him without touching, her eyes fixed on the stars. He felt the stares burning his back. Every smirk, every whisper said the same. A stranger now bound to a woman who carried scandal like a brand. A burden he had not chosen, yet could not cast aside. The rancher lifted his hat, set it firm on his head, and offered her his arm. Slowly, deliberately, she took it. The street went silent again. They walked together through the dust, not as two souls joined by love, but as two trapped by circumstance forced down a path neither could turn away from. And somewhere, in the shadows of the saloon porch, the drunk watched with a crooked smile, the bottle tipped in his hand, plotting what might come next. The morning after the wedding dawned pale and cold, the prairie winds carrying a thin veil of dust across the town. Dry Creek stirred uneasily, as if the earth itself had overheard the vows spoken under lamplight and found them bitter. The rancher led his horse through the main street, with the new bride at his side. Neither spoke. The silence between them was a wall, but the silence of the town was a judgment. Doors opened a crack as they passed. Old men squinted from rocking chairs, their pipes hanging loose in disbelief. Women paused at water pumps, whispering behind their shawls, their eyes cutting sharper than knives. Children, too young to know shame, but quick to learn cruelty, laughed and pointed, mimicking drunken stumbles as they called out, "Card girl, card girl." The rancher kept his head forward, his hand tightening on the reins until his knuckles showed white. The bride's lips pressed thin, her shoulders squared against the blows of mockery. But inside the saloon, the cruelty was louder. The drunk who had dragged her into the street now basked in laughter, slamming his bottle on the table, telling and retelling the story. Each retelling grew darker, uglier, until the room roared with jeers. By noon, the town's gossip had become law. In Dry Creek, a man was measured by the woman at his side, and a woman by the path that led her there. The rancher found work harder to come by. Merchants raised prices when he entered, their voices honeyed but their eyes gleaming with contempt. When he bought nails for his fence, the blacksmith muttered loud enough for the crowd to hear, "Build it high, stranger. Ain't no wall strong enough to keep out shame." That evening, the rancher returned to his land with his bride. Their footsteps echoed in the empty rooms of his weathered house, the silence of solitude now cut with her presence. She walked from room to room, her hands trailing along rough timber, her face unreadable. Outside, coyotes called across the barren fields, voices more welcoming than the townfolk, but the town would not let them be. On the third day, while the rancher hauled water from the well, he heard horses approaching. A group of men dismounted, boots crunching on dry earth. The drunk led them, swaggering, his face flushed red with whiskey and triumph. Behind him were ranch hands, shopkeepers, even a deputy who should have upheld the law. "Thought you could make her yours with a few words, stranger," the drunk sneered. "But we all know what she island. That chapel didn't wash her clean. She was won at cards, and that's all she'll ever be." The rancher set down the bucket, his shoulders rising and falling slow, steady, like a man containing fire. His hand slid to the revolver at his hip. The bride stood on the porch, her eyes burning but her body still. The men laughed louder, feeding on each other's cruelty, their shadows long in the dying light. "You want to prove she's yours?" one of them called. "Bring her to the dance next week. Let her stand where everyone can see what kind of woman shares your bed." They mounted their horses again, dust rising behind them like smoke from a brush fire. Their laughter trailed long after they were gone. The rancher stood staring at the empty horizon, jaw clenched so tight his teeth ached. The bride stepped down from the porch, her bare feet stirring dust, and placed a hand on his arm. He did not move. That night, the wind rattled the shutters, and the house groaned as though it carried the town's judgment in its bones. By the fire, the bride sat straight-backed, her eyes fixed on the flames. "They won't stop," she said quietly. "Not until you bend, or they break us both." "How?" The rancher looked at her then, really looked, as if seeing not just the woman, but the burden she bore, the scars unseen beneath her defiance. Outside, Dry Creek slept, but in that small house, two souls wrestled with chains that were not of their making. And though neither would say it aloud, both knew the truth. The struggle had only just begun. The prairie turned colder as autumn deepened, the winds carrying with them a silence that seemed to settle inside the ranch house as much as outside. For days after the men had ridden off, the rancher and his bride worked the land side by side, speaking little. Yet silence, though heavy, began to shape into something else, something steadier, like two storms circling one another until they finally moved in rhythm. At dawn, the rancher rose as he always had, the smell of coffee rising from the old iron pot on the stove. For the first time, though, the aroma wasn't his doing. The bride had woken before him, moving through the house with a quiet assurance. She wore her skirt tucked up for work, her hair tied back, her hands already smudged with flour. When he entered the kitchen, she didn't look up. She simply set down a cup at his place. It was a small gesture, but the air between them shifted. The days grew longer with labor. The ranch's fences were broken in stretches, the herd scattered thin across brittle grass. Together, they patched the rails, driving nails until their hands blistered. When one rail split beneath the hammer, the rancher cursed under his breath. She stepped forward, steady hands guiding his, showing him how to brace the wood. Their eyes met, the briefest flicker of something unspoken, before he turned back to his work. At night, the prairie was a world of firelight and shadows. Coyotes called from the hills, and the wind rattled through the shutters. The bride sat near the hearth, mending what clothes she had, her fingers swift and sure. One evening, as the firelight painted her face in gold and shadow, she spoke not with bitterness, but with quiet resolve. "I was raised outside Santa Fe," she began, her voice low. "My father was a gambler. He lost more than coin, lost land, horses, even me in the end." She held the needle still, her eyes fixed on the flame. "I learned quick that men wager what they don't value, and women pay the price." The rancher said nothing at first, the weight of her words pressing against the silence. He thought of the preacher's decree, the whispers in town, the men's laughter. He thought of the chains placed on her and on him. At last, he stirred the fire, the sparks rising like stars. "I've seen men sell cattle, horses, even bullets they couldn't spare. But selling people—" His voice caught. He shook his head. "That's no man's right." The words lingered. She set the mended cloth aside, her gaze lifting to him. "And yet, here we are, tied together because one drunk thought me worth no more than the bottle in his hand." His eyes met hers across the fire. "You're worth more than this whole cursed town." For a heartbeat, the walls of silence cracked. Her lips parted, but no answer came. She only nodded once, firm, and turned back to her stitching. Yet from that night, something had changed. They began to share the weight of chores without words. He drew water, she tended cattle. He split logs, she stacked them. Slowly, the house, once a hollow shell, began to feel alive. She sang softly as she worked, old songs in Spanish her mother had taught her, filling the rooms with a warmth he had never known. In return, he showed her how to ride the land, guiding her through gullies and ridges, teaching her how to track cattle by hoofprint and dust. One evening, a storm rolled in, dark clouds swallowing the prairie. The two hurried to drive the herd toward shelter, rain cutting the air like whips. Lightning split the sky, thunder shook the earth, and in the chaos, One steer broke away. Without hesitation, she rode hard after it, hair streaming wild, eyes blazing with fearless fire. The rancher galloped close behind, watching her lean low in the saddle, rope flying through the storm as she caught the steer clean. By the time they drove it back, both were soaked, shivering, mud streaking their faces. And for the first time, he laughed deep, surprised, raw. She laughed with him, their voices lost in the storm. That night, as the rain hammered the roof, they sat close by the fire, sharing what little warmth they could. Her head rested lightly against his shoulder, her eyes half closed. Neither spoke of vows, or of burdens, or of what the town thought. In that moment, there was only survival, and a fragile strength born from it. Outside, Dry Creek would still whisper. Men would still mock. But within those four weathered walls, a quiet bond had begun to grow, like a flame refusing to die against the wind. The prairie had been restless all week, the wind sharp and dry, carrying with it the smell of something coming. The rancher felt it in his bones. The bride felt it too each night she stood at the porch rail, staring into the dark horizon as if expecting riders. And on the seventh night, they came. It began with the glow of torches in the distance, a jagged line of fire weaving across the hills. Then came the thunder of hooves, rolling toward the ranch like a storm loosed from the heavens. The drunk was at their head, face twisted with fury, bottle gone but rage burning brighter than whiskey ever had. Behind him rode men of Dry Creek, men who had laughed in the saloon, men who spat in the dust when the couple passed. Tonight, their laughter was gone. Tonight, they came with gun. The rancher was already at the barn, his revolver loaded, shotgun slung across his shoulder. He kicked open the door, eyes scanning the herd. They'll drive the cattle, burn the house, leave nothing. His voice was steady, but his heart pounded like the hooves rushing nearer. The bride gripped her rifle, the barrel gleaming in firelight. Her face was streaked with dust, hair whipping in the rising wind. Then we fight. The first shots cracked across the fields. Bullets tore through fence posts, splinters flying. Torches arced through the air, smashing against dry boards. Flames leapt high, licking greedily at the walls of the barn. The cattle screamed, breaking into a stampede, crashing through rails as the earth shook beneath their hooves. The rancher fired into the dark, muzzle flashes splitting the night. Men fell from saddles, their cries swallowed by the roar of fire and thunder. The bride stood firm on the porch, rifle braced against her shoulder, each shot clean and true. One rider tumbled into the dirt, torch spinning from his hand. Another wheeled his horse, shrieking as her bullet found his leg. But the fire spread faster than bullets could stop. Flames wrapped the barn, leapt to the corral, crawled toward the house. Smoke rolled thick, choking the night. The rancher coughed, his eyes stinging, yet he fought on, revolver blazing. The drunk rode through the chaos, laughing wild, his revolver spitting lead. "Look at your fine bride now," he roared, firing at the porch. The bullet tore splinters inches from her head. She did not flinch. She leveled her rifle, sight fixed on his chest, but in that instant, a rider barreled into her, knocking her back. The rifle clattered from her hands, sliding across the porch. The rancher's heart stopped. He fired at the rider, dropping him in a cloud of dust, then sprinted toward the house. The drunk wheeled his horse, closing in, revolver raised, grin savage in the firelight. The duel was inevitable. They faced each other in the burning yard, flames painting their shadows against the ground. The drunk dismounted, staggering forward, revolver steady despite the whiskey in his veins. The rancher's revolver was empty. He tossed it aside, reaching for the shotgun slung across his back too slow. The drunk fired. The blast seared past, grazing the rancher's side. He stumbled, pain flashing like lightning, but he held his ground. The bride, crawling across the porch, found her rifle. She shouted his name, her voice raw, but he did not look back. His eyes were locked on the drunk. Another shot rang out. The rancher lunged forward, shotgun roaring. The blast threw the drunk off his feet, the revolver spinning from his hand. He hit the dirt hard, torch tumbling beside him. Fire caught his coat, flames crawling up his body as he screamed into the night. Silence fell, broken only by the crackle of fire and the frantic lowing of cattle. The other riders, seeing their leader fall, fled into the dark, their torches vanishing over the ridge. But victory carried no triumph. The barn was gone, reduced to a skeleton of fire. Half the herd had scattered into the prairie, lost. The rancher sank to his knees, hand pressed to his bleeding side, eyes locked on the ruins of all he had built. The bride dropped beside him, her hands trembling as she pressed cloth to the wound. "You're not leaving me," she whispered, fierce and desperate. "Not after this." The flames consumed the night, their glow reaching the heavens. The rancher, half conscious, felt her grip like iron, unyielding. In the ruins of fire and ash, the fight was not yet over. But as the horizon flickered with the last of the burning, one truth carved itself deep into their bones. Their old lives had been destroyed. Whatever future remained, it would be written in the ashes. Smoke still lingered in the dawn after the fire, curling in gray ribbons across the blackened ruins. The barn lay in ashes, the corrals charred skeletons against the pale horizon. The prairie was quiet, save for the slow crackle of smoldering timbers and the soft moan of cattle wandering the outskirts. The drunk's body had burned with the flames, and the rest of his gang had scattered like coyotes, leaving only ruin in their wake. The rancher, wounded but breathing, sat on the porch steps with his side bandaged in rough cloth. His bride knelt beside him, her hands stained with ash and blood, her eyes hollow from the fight but unbroken. For hours they sat together, watching the fire eat away the life he had built, until there was nothing left but embers glowing against the dirt. When the sun rose high, the townsfolk began to arrive. Men who had laughed in the saloon, women who had turned their backs. They came quiet now, hats in their hands, their faces pale. The preacher's wife stepped forward first, her eyes heavy with shame. No one spoke, no one dared. The rancher said nothing, only held his bride's hand, their fingers locked in the silence. Respect, long denied, had been won not by choice but by fire and blood. 6 months passed. Spring touched the prairie, green pushing through the black scars of winter's ash. A new barn rose from the earth, timbers straight and strong, the smell of fresh-cut pine mixing with the sweet grass. The house, once hollow, now hummed with life. The bride tended a small garden by the porch, rows of corn pushing high, sunflowers stretching bold toward the sky. Children from town, who once had mocked, now came to help, chasing chickens across the yard, their laughter ringing bright against the open fields. The rancher walked slower these days, the wound in his side never fully healed, but his shoulders carried a new strength. On the barn's highest beam, freshly carved letters gleamed dark against the wood, 2 names side by side, a mark no fire could erase. The bride wore a silver necklace, tarnished but cherished, the only thing she had kept from her mother. Each morning she touched it, as if anchoring herself to a life no longer chained to shame. And in town, things had changed. When the rancher walked down Main Street, men nodded, their voices quiet with respect. The blacksmith offered tools at fair price. The saloon no longer roared with his bride's name as a jest. Instead, whispers of her rifle in the fire, her courage in the flames, carried like legend. Even the preacher, who once bound them in chains of duty, now tipped his hat with something closer to reverence. 1 year later, the prairie blazed gold with summer. On the porch of the rebuilt house, the rancher and his bride sat together at twilight, the fields glowing in the dying light. His hand found hers, rough and scarred, yet gentle. Between them, a small fire burned in a metal pan, its glow warm against the falling dark. They watched it in silence, the memory of the night that had nearly broken them flickering in the flames. She leaned her head against his shoulder, her voice soft. "We didn't choose this road." "No," he answered, his eyes on the horizon, "but we walked it anyway." Her hand brushed the carved beam above them, the letters etched deep. "And we made it ours." The prairie wind rose, carrying with it the smell of hay and earth, the sound of cattle lowing in distant pastures. For the first time, the land felt less like a burden and more like home. In the fire's glow, their shadows stretched long across the porch, 2 figures bound not by chance, but by resilience, by defiance, by a love that had grown from ashes. Out beyond Dry Creek, the Wild West rolled on storms, dust, blood, and beauty in equal measure. But here, on this small patch of prairie, two souls who had been thrown together by cruelty had carved something lasting from ruin. If this story touched your heart, ride with us again across the untold trails of the Wild West. Don't forget to subscribe to keep the fire of these stories alive.